Opinions. Everyone's got them. And if you're like me and you grew up in the time before we lived and died by whatever was written on the internet, well, we lived and died by what was written in these video game magazines. They're like a time capsule. So I thought I'd dig a few issues out. I chose the month of August because it's August right now, and just see how these reviews held up. I chose some games that are somewhat available today, or maybe they just meant something to me. Before we dive into this August edition of Game Players Magazine, I'd like to just talk about a letter that I found that was published inside of it that I think still holds up today. Basically, here it's called More Zelda, Less Yen, written by JK, just kidding, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Basically complaining about the high prices of video games. And they say 60 bucks is more than enough for any one game. Couldn't agree more. Now 60 bucks and $94, well, with inflation, that's like 130 bucks in 2025 US dollars. So let's wind the clock back 31 years. And the cover story of this is all about Maximum Carnage, which was a game that really competed for my attention back in 94. Pretty stacked year. But this game adapted the comic event of the year prior, the big crossover event. Spider-Man and almost his whole universe and almost the whole Marvel universe got involved in this one big storyline. They shoved it into the game, and it turned out pretty well. And they had little pixelated panels that were put into the story. The review does go on to say that the backgrounds are a bit drab, the enemies get a bit repetitive, and I'd say that's all pretty true if you compare it to other side-scrolling beat 'em ups that were on the market at the time. Your Streets of Rages, your Final Fights, yeah, it doesn't maybe hold up quite as good as those. One thing it did have that the others didn't, though, is it came on a pretty cool red cartridge. Nice. And also had a soundtrack by Green Jelly. So, hey, let's pretend like we knew who they were. I don't believe the game has ever been reissued or made any kind of remaster or anything like that in the years since. In fact, I think it was one of LJN's last games. So, hey, going out on a high note. There's a game coming out pretty soon, Cosmic Invasion, another side-scrolling beat 'em up. You probably heard about it. Spider-Man, and that game kind of looks like this game. So I like that little callback if that's what that is. All told, game players gave it an 80%, and I'd say that's a pretty accurate and fair assessment. Now, while Maximum Carnage really adapted a specific comic book storyline pretty well, the next game I'm going to tell you about, called Comic Zone, which was covered in 1 year later in Game Players August 95, really adapted being inside of a comic like no other game had. You play as a comic creator, you're jumping between panels, even between whole pages, and enemies are being drawn in front of you and you're fighting them. I think it was really cool. And in fact, the graphics were also really great. Old Game Players here, they just gave it a 72%, which is a pretty average score. Next Generation magazine here gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Look at this! Look at this paper stock. It's so nice. You don't get nice paper stock in magazines anymore. Why they say that? They call it a Final Fight clone, which I think is a pretty disingenuous thing to say. It's much more innovative and original. The comic thing on its own is what sets it apart. It is true, just a side-scrolling beat 'em up, but it also had a much better story that was going on because you had someone talking to you, guiding you through the story as well. Graphics, they're great. All these side-scrolling beat 'em ups have sewer levels. Comic Zone has the best sewer level I think I'd ever seen. But maybe people kind of forgot about it, didn't really know too much about it because by 95, people were looking towards basically the Sega Saturn and also the PlayStation. 32X was on the market, even though it wasn't really doing great. That's what Sega was pushing. They weren't really pushing a lot of their Genesis games so much. So this game never had a sequel that I know of or any real kind of follow-up. However, you can get it on several old Sega compilations, one from the previous generation called the Genesis Classics. It's been discontinued, but you can probably still find it on the aftermarket pretty easily. And also Sonic's Ultimate Genesis Collection from the PS3 360 era. And I'm sure it's coming to a Nintendo Online Sega channel pretty soon. I would not be surprised. There's also a demo I just saw for a game called Comix Zero, also with an X. Not related to Comic Zone. They call it a Metroidvania style game, but it still has the same style where you're going through panels and the like. Haven't played it. Not sure if it's good. Might be. One way to find out. Another game everyone was really excited for, Jumping Flash. Remember that one? Came out about 30 years ago. It was an open zone platform where you were inside of a bunny mecha suit, wandering around these levels, somewhere inside of a pyramid. You had enemies to blast, collecting these carrots to help you jump higher and get through a level. Funny thing about this review, they give it a 94, and you hadn't really seen any games like this at the time. They're kind of pretty commonplace now, but this is one of the first, and kind of the first game where I saw on the PlayStation and thought, wow, anything really is possible on this system. The review starts out, what an unfortunate condition it is that original game ideas are so few and far between in the video game industry. Huh. And these days, everyone's like, it's all just remasters and reissues and sequels. Well, even 30 years ago, they were saying the same thing. Anyway, I highly recommend Jumping Flash. You can get it on PlayStation Plus. You can also download it on the PlayStation Store if you ever want to give it a shot. You can't use the analog joysticks with it. You got to use the D-pad because that's the way it was at the time. Maybe they'll make a new one where you got better controls. But until then, well, I guess we'll just have to do with that. All right, let's move on and talk about some fighting games. And here's one where the hype was real, let me tell you. It's called Battle Arena Toshinden. I don't hear people talking about this game so much anymore, but I feel like they were talking about this game for like years leading into it, or at least it felt like years. And then when it finally came out, well, we got a game player's review here from this issue, 98%. And as I recall, they did not give this score out very highly. That was like the second time they gave out a score this high. The last one was like a year ago for Super Street Fighter 2 on the Super Nintendo. And they were definitely loving this when they were playing it. What it's probably one of the first 3D fighters, polygonal, really great graphics. Looking back at it today, it is pretty slow and chunky looking, but the graphics, I think, at least from my old eyes, still hold up pretty well. You had projectiles, you had weapons, so it was a little bit of Virtua Fighter, a little bit of Street Fighter, a little bit of, I guess, Samurai Showdown. This review ends kind of ironically. It says, if you buy only one title for your PlayStation, make sure it's this one. It's the kind of game that not only wows your friends, but it'll hold up over time. I say ironic because there was a sequel, Toshinden 2, a third one that I don't think left Japan, and then the franchise just kind of faded away. If you want to play a more modern equivalent, well, I guess you could look to Soul Calibur, which is basically the same thing in a lot of ways. The 90s were a really magical time for fighting games. I don't know if we really knew how good we had it. We had all these fancy 3D fighting games coming out, but the 2D fighting games are really killing it. You could go to the arcades and find a bunch of SNK fighting games. Fatal Fury was a great series. And they also brought them home to home consoles. Now, they weren't as good as the Neo Geo ports on your Super Nintendo or your Sega Genesis, but they were still pretty fun just the same. Now, we got a review here for Fatal Fury 2 from the August 94 Game Players. They give it an 81%, which is really generous. The thing that sets Fatal Fury apart is that you can go in the background or the foreground, which really helps with your offense and your defense. The graphics are great. Backgrounds are a bit flat, that's true. But, they had to squeeze a pretty big game in these small cartridges. You can get Fatal Fury 2 on the Super Nintendo Online, on Nintendo Online, which is actually even better port than this Genesis version. So it's well worth the play. It's pretty fun. They call it a Street Fighter clone, basically, and it kind of is. But Street Fighter's fun, and so is this. A year later, Next Generation Magazine would cover Fatal Fury 3 on the Neo Geo, and they did not like this game that much. They gave it 2 stars. They said it feels very same to the other Fatal Fury games. Personally, I love Fatal Fury 3. One of the better things it had was that it was 3 planes. You could go foreground, middle ground, background. Maybe it doesn't sound as cool as being able to go 3D like a lot of the other current fighters of the day, but I think that the planes actually gave you a different focus and a different way to strategize, and it was definitely faster. These games were way faster than any of the 3D fighting games, and it kept me come back for more. I don't know. I feel if you play a 2 or 3D fighting game and you lose a couple rounds, I'm just kind of done with it. But Fatal Fury, man, I could play that for ages and get beat up, and I just keep coming back for more.
What you playing?
Fatal Fury 3. You can still get this actually on the Arcade Archives series, on the current gen, the previous gen, and you can see just how great they look. They're big sprites, very colorful, well worth your time. This August 95 issue of Game Players had a promotion for Earthbound where you could scratch and sniff. We're warning you, this game stinks. Oh, the stinky things, they actually did stink. Terrible marketing this game had. Can't believe anyone ever liked it. I guess they didn't like it at the time. Somehow it got a cult following. Anyway, that's Earthbound. You're telling me the game stinks. No wonder no one played it. But the cover story, Killer Instinct. Boo, yeah. That came out also in late 95. And boy, did it come out to a bang. Just when you thought the Super Nintendo was done and finished, they deliver this really cool looking fighting game. It was an arcade fighting game. It was a popular fighting game in the arcades. They squished it down to the 16-bit cartridge, and the review kind of makes fun of the fact. That's one of the negatives it says is that, oh, it's too bad you got to squish this game down to such a small size. I think that should be celebrated. That's pretty impressive. They actually managed to fit the game and make it look as good as it did, especially considering the other games that were on the market. And they were still trying to push the Super Nintendo and say, hey, if you got the system, here's something to still keep you playing it. And if you did get it on cartridge, and I'm showing you Nintendo Online footage here because I still play it on Nintendo Online, but you get a nice sweet black cartridge. And that's not all. You would get the Killer Cuts CD. Remember CDs? This CD is still my jam when I'm out trying to pump some iron at the gym or I'm driving like a maniac outside. Let's give it a listen. He's a killer. I'm just kidding. I hate driving, but I love racing games for some reason. I still play all the new ones. Your Forza, your Gran Turismo, Dirt. Love Dirt, but the benchmark has always been Daytona USA. It was covered in the '95 August edition of Game Players. They got a bunch of PlayStation and Saturn games all in one issue. It was the first one they covered it, so it was like 32-bit overload. And boy, did they love Daytona USA. I did too. The first time I saw this game was in an arcade. My brother and I would go to watch the movies. Before the movie would start, we'd go next door to the arcade and play a few rounds. Those were the days. And they got the Daytona machine in there. I couldn't get near it because of all the punks that are hanging around it. So I think I had to play like hard driving or some crap like that to just bide the time. But the entire time I was watching the movie after the fact, I didn't remember what the movie was. True Lies, maybe? I wasn't even thinking about it. I was thinking about Daytona, USA. Let's go away. Why do I love this game so much? Does it hold up well? It's not even remotely realistic. Like you're driving like 230 kilometers an hour, you smash into a wall, your hood gets crumpled up. That's about it. Boom, you're back driving 200 kilometers an hour again. The review, it just says, it's just fun. I think that just sums it up. It's a fun game. There's some bad draw in, the background, foreground comes into view as you're driving into it. Had it on the Saturn. It was really bad there. I didn't really care. I still thought it was just that much fun. And I still enjoyed it. In fact, I still play it to this day. Pretty hard to come by. Maybe there's some licensing issues. Why it was just recently taken off the Xbox store. If you got a PS3 and it's still hooked up online, maybe you can get it there. That's one place where I like to play it. Another game that was also covered in the same issue was Ridge Racer, which also was recently reissued on the Arcade Archive series. Game players in their review, they acknowledge the fact that Daytona was a better racing game than Ridge Racer. Frankly, I don't think Ridge Racer has aged quite that well. There's really slip-slidey controls. Graphics are kind of, they're fine, I guess. But yeah, if you got to pick between the two, Daytona was definitely the better game. Panzer Dragoon, a very wild, fast-paced shooter. We were on top of a dragon, had to train it. And then you shoot all the threats around you. I always struggled with the clockwise viewpoint moving around. It's a rail shooter, so you can only roughly sort of control your movements. There's a remake that just came out a couple of years ago. Didn't get very high reviews, but it is regularly on sale, and I think it's fun enough. I'd say it's worth checking out if you got the time. Why not? I'm a pretty big Star Wars nerd, and I was very easily impressed by a lot of things back in the 90s, especially games on CD like Rebel Assault. Game Players covered it, and I think that's reviews what pushed me to want to get it. They gave it a 72, which is pretty average. And looking back on the game, it is actually quite average. But man, those digitized, albeit very pixelated scenes from the movie that were playing out, they looked pretty cool. I didn't have a laser disc, so this is the first time I saw Star Wars on CD at the time. It's a rail shooter, pretty limited one, in fact. Although you do get a bunch of ships to play through, you can't pick them. You play through what's essentially the movie's plot with a bit of the Battle of Hoth thrown in there as well. Is it a great game? No, not really. I don't know if I could really recommend it in 2025. If you want a retro Star Wars game, there's the X-Wing and TIE Fighter games. Those are great. The Rebel Squadron games on GameCube, even Dark Forces, even Star Wars Arcade, even Rebel Assault 2. You can get Rebel Assault 2 on the PlayStation Store, actually. And Rebel Assault 1 and 2 are in a pack on the Steam Store. So if you want to check it out, they're actually pretty on the cheap. And they're decent for, a little bit of playing around. Well, that's it for this video. And you might be asking yourself, hey, Booty Brown, why don't you get yourself a capture card like a civilized person? Well, that's because I don't have one. This is my first video, and I didn't know if anyone's going to watch it. So if you did, hey, why not give it a thumbs up and let me know? Maybe I'll make another one. September's coming up. Anyway, thanks for watching.